we are going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Melissa Kish, and I get the extreme honor and privilege to serve as the Executive Director for Sigma Delta Tau. And I am trying my best to stay chill with our experience tonight. I am a personal fan of our hosts and know that we are in for quite an exciting evening. So when we had the opportunity to do our final all-member program for this academic year, we were looking at opportunities of what that might look like. And thanks in advance to our friends from the foundation, specifically the Empower Circle, we had this opportunity. And so it was important to us this past year, and even beyond this past year, we've been having a lot of difficult conversations as individuals, as humans in this world, and as members of Sigma Delta Tau. And we know and we believe that it is important that some of the most difficult conversations happen with the people that we love the most. And so when we knew that we really wanted to spend some time and resources thinking about how do we disagree with grace, how do we have these hard conversations that are needed to move the organization forward, we knew we needed Sarah and Beth. So I am thrilled to welcome Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers. They're the co-hosts of the popular podcast Pantsuit Politics. They're also co-authors of the book, I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening, a guide to grace-filled political conversations. Pantsuit Politics, if you are not familiar, has been featured in The Atlantic, The Guardian, MSNBC's Morning Joe, and Parents and Elle magazine. Both Sarah and Beth attended Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, and then received their Juris Doctorates, Sarah from American University and Beth from the University of Kentucky. Sarah began her career as a congressional staffer, campaign aide, and blogger and social media consultant. She currently lives in Paducah, Kentucky, where she served a term as city commissioner and sits on the boards of numerous civic organizations. Beth has practiced law and served as a human resource executive and business coach. Beth lives in Union, Kentucky, and serves on several local boards of directors. Sarah and Beth speak frequently to fraternities, business, other organizations as well, about improving political dialogue and having hard conversation. We encourage you throughout the presentation. We're going to be able to ask questions as we go that Sarah and Beth are going to respond to and weave into what they're talking about. So please use the chat function as any questions that you have come up. You can drop them in the chat. You can also go ahead and direct message to anyone that is identified as a host, and we will make sure that they see that question. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Beth.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you so much, everyone, for hosting us tonight. We're excited to spend some time with you. We love talking to our Panhellenic sisters. We were both Phi Mu's at Transylvania University, and talking with women who invest in long-term relationships with each other is one of our very favorite things to do.
Yeah, I think that sororities offer what everyone is looking for right now, right? A sense of purpose, a shared mission, the idea that we would orient ourselves and our relationships and our conversations around a shared set of values and principles. I think that they really offer a path forward for a lot of what we're seeing now in communities across the country. So that's why they're our favorite groups to talk to. And this is really a conversation, like Beth said, like nobody wants to be lectured over Zoom anymore. I've gotten a lot of that over the last year. And so what we really love to do in these settings is to answer questions. We want to hear immediately. You don't have to, don't say we can lecture anytime. That's very sweet, Don. Like we want to hear like what you're struggling with right now. What are the conversations that are throwing you for a loop, that are leaving you frustrated? I'm a crier, like, you know, so what conversations are you walking away from in frustrated tears? Because that's where we can really explore together and give you guys advice and stories and principles that will help in your life day to day, instead of just, you know, giving you this sort of one size fits all talk. So you don't have to wait for us to hit a point. You don't have to wait for us to wrap up our talk. Start telling us what you're struggling with right now, because that is our favorite thing to do. That's when we feel like the talks go the best and people get the most out of it. So we are here for you, and we want to hear what you're struggling with for it. Definitely.
And I like Karen's spirit. She's like, let's just dive right into the conflict in the Mideast. Okay. I've been thinking and talking about this basically all day, so maybe I'll kick us off. But Sarah and I have not gotten to talk to each other about this yet, so I'm interested in having a little bit of that conversation here. As I begin, anytime I think about Israel and Palestine, I start with the notion that there are so many people living in that region who just want to have normal lives. They want to live in houses. They want to go to work every day. They want to take care of their kids and raise their families. They want to go to weddings and funerals and just birthday parties and live life. And they didn't choose to be in the middle of this generational conflict. And they don't choose the people who, or have varying degrees of confidence, at least, in the people who make decisions about launching rockets and deploying police forces. And so I think one of the best things that we can do as Americans is remember the humanity of everyone impacted when this kind of violence escalates. And then I think the second best thing that we can do is try our best to ground present reality in history and to understand that this is a long, complex relationship that has been influenced by outside forces throughout time. You can look at the UK's role, the United States, Russia, Jordan, Egypt. We are not just talking about two groups of people, and we are not talking about two monolithic groups of people. And so to me, holding on to all that complexity and the humanity of everybody involved gives me a jumping off point to recognize that this is just such a fragile situation always. And it is fragile when we're not thinking about it here in America. And it doesn't take a lot of shifts for this really old conflict to resurface. And because of political turmoil, both with the Palestinian Authority and with Israel, Sarah's been talking about this forever. God bless Israel. They've had 4 elections and still have this caretaker government instead of, a real functioning government. So you've got all this political turmoil. You have these disputes over who's entitled to land in certain parts of Jerusalem. You have COVID. I think COVID is not listed in any of these articles, but I keep thinking about the pandemic and how it influences the situation and everyone's kind of thresholds. And then you have Ramadan, Jerusalem Day, like all of these moments in time in these really sacred places to 3 of the world's major religions, all happening at once. And it's a lot, and it's heartbreaking, and it's a reminder. And this kind of gets to like our whole premise tonight. Difficult things left to fester do, and they will always come back around.
Yeah. As we're working on our second book, what we've really been thinking a lot about and talking a lot about when it comes to intense political conflict is the role of trauma and compounding trauma. And particularly when you're talking about COVID, which gets to some of the other questions that people are asking, like we just have these compounding traumas. Everywhere in the world experienced COVID and is experiencing presently COVID. Every American, whether or not they decided that COVID was real or they wanted to wear a mask, whatever their stance was, I believe that every single American had a moment where they thought, could I die from this? Could someone I love die from this? Not to mention the people who actually did have someone they love die from COVID. So we're all affected by it around the world, but particularly in the country. And, I wear a bracelet. My word for this year is gentle. And so I wear this bracelet that a listener sent us with the word gentle on it, because everybody is just all frayed edges right now. Everybody is just so raw. And there's this paradox that happens in a moment like this where we are both raw and need to take extreme care with one another, and also raw and have extreme clarity about all the things that are wrong and need attention. It's like these competing forces of, like, you hear so much in politics right now, like, this is a once in a lifetime moment. This is a once in a generation moment. We have a moment for real change. And also that, like, everybody's this kind of like very tender wounded creature. And that's just, both things are true. You know, we like to do binaries. We like to do binaries in America, and we certainly like to do binaries in the Middle East. And so really, I think at any opportunity to say, like, am I being forced into a this or that, that is in fact not a this or that. Am I being given with, like, being presented with a choice of A and B when there are lots of other choices out there, is something I always try to keep, like, front and center when we have really difficult conversations, because I just think that's like the default of our brains. It's a lot of like basic human psychology, and the harder the conversation gets, the more we want a victim and a villain. And we are all different combinations of victims and villains. And, you know, that the strong characterization of one or the other only really works in storybooks. It doesn't ever really work in real life. And so I think that the complexity of our human interactions and our human psychology on an individual level, much less on a national level or a global level, is just something that we're always trying desperately to hold, and hold carefully and gently, because it's a lot to hold. And I think COVID has shown us how hard it is to hold all that, how hard it is to hold someone who we feel like is threatening our safety, who is threatening our family's safety, that sense that we're all connected. And so if you're not doing what you're supposed to, you are exposing me to risk. That's really, really hard. You know, we had a conversation on Friday and described it as a feeling of like civic betrayal. You feel like these people that you're supposed to be in a civic relationship with have betrayed you. And I think that's going to take a long time to get over with and to deal with, and that we're going to have to be very gentle with each other in the process. I will say, Dawn said, people, we won't get vaccinated. And here's just a reminder I got in my own life that I'm going to share. I was talking to my college roommate who has not gotten vaccinated yet. And I was like, but like, why? And she's an accountant. So she said, first of all, I don't have a single day to spare. I do not have a single day to spare with side effects of the shot, not right now. And she had COVID in November. And she said, I want to be able to I want to have time and space to like read the ingredients, look at the research myself and make a decision. And it was just a really good reminder to me that like everyone who has not received the vaccine is not in some sort of like stubborn QAnon position that they're not going to get the vaccine. Like some people, it is true and sincere hesitancy, or it is true and sincere life situation. And so like, that was just a really good reminder to me, because I think we get in these like very like stereotypical stories about why big groups of people are or are not doing something. And it's always like important to remember there's way, way more complexity. And some of that, you know, Judy mentioned social media. Some of that comes from social media. So social media pushes conflict. The algorithm rewards strong reactions, and we react strongly to those stereotypes, those binaries, those victim villain characterizations. Like our brain loves that, the algorithm loves that. And so we feed the algorithm, and the algorithm feeds us on social media. And so I think that pull is always really, really important to keep in mind.
And those binaries that Sarah has been talking about so inhibit our creativity. An accountant who might get the vaccine if it were easy, that's a problem we should be able to solve. You know, at this point, when we know that we have enough supply of the vaccine, what creative ways can we come up with to take it to people where they are? And if someone was hesitant and wouldn't take that step to like make the appointment and go to the place and do the thing, how can we bring it to them where they might just go, oh yeah, fine. Okay, you're here, I'm here, let's do it. And I think we struggle. I feel this way about the situation with Israelis and Palestinians as well. We've been talking about the same solution there for over 70 years. If that solution were so obvious and so workable, wouldn't we have done it? by now, but like we're stuck in we don't have any creativity coming out of this because we see that situation in such a binary way. So I really worry about our problem solving skills being eroded in the face of choosing, this is the hero and this is the villain in a particular story.
Cassidy asked, she said, I struggle with the if-then phrasing I'm seeing. If you believe support X, then Y. Unfollow me. You're a terrible person. Don't talk to me. I think that is so true. What our driving principle and fundamental value is that we do not dehumanize. There are no garbage people. There are certainly garbage opinions, and I could run off a list that's very long if you would like to hear it of what I feel some certain garbage opinions are. But I try to stay very strongly rooted in that there are no garbage people. That doesn't mean I'm going to share my platform with people. That doesn't mean I'm going to vote for people. That doesn't mean I'm going to welcome people in a close personal relationship with me. It just means that I will respect their basic human dignity and I will not dehumanize, period. Because first, the dehumanizing, you are not worth anything if you don't think this. If you don't check these boxes for me, then like you don't deserve anything. To me, that is harmful to me. The dehumanizing affects me. It's not a finite resource. We don't give more humanity to one group by extracting it from another. That's not how it works. And so I think that just remembering that, like, the giving of humanity, the recognizing of basic human dignity is something that we have to stay really strong in. And I think that, in certain places, for example, Twitter, it is hard for people to stay rooted in that because there's a mob mentality. Absolutely. There's a rewarding, there's this feeling of self-righteousness. I'm checking the boxes. I'm saying the right things. And certainly I'm like pushing out the people who don't check those boxes. The in-group out-grouping, which we love to do as humans, we love it so hard. That is really, really detrimental. And I think when it comes to the concerns about cancel culture, what I just try to keep in mind is, where is the power in the relationship? Is this person punching down or are they punching up? You know what I mean? Are they calling to truth, some power that's above them that needs to be called to the mat and held responsible for their behavior? Or is it someone with a lot of power using their platform to silence someone who doesn't have a lot of power? And also I try to look at is it proportional? If it's someone losing their job when they've used the power inside that job to exploit other people, then I think that's a proportional and correct response. If it's a really young person who said or did something without fully recognizing the consequences, with huge consequences on down the road for them, well, then maybe we need to talk about it. I think the proportionality of consequences to action is something to really keep in mind. But cancel culture has come to mean so many things. I mean, people will use it to talk about Harvey Weinstein. People will use it to talk about poor cable truck driver who used the OK symbol and then got fired. It's a really broad spectrum. And so I think I'm trying to orient myself now about where's the power and is the consequence proportional? Because there's a lot going on inside that term that we have to really pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that with the kind of situation Cassidy's talking about, and also with cancel culture, it's important to think about what's the goal. So I look at something that really bugs me about social media is sort of the bias toward humor, because I think there are a lot of situations where being funny is not a good goal, because it's just not funny to some people, right? There is an exclusionary quality to a lot of good humor, unfortunately. And so when I see tweets that are good morning to everyone except fill in the blank, I'm can we not keep mimicking these things that really wear on us? And you can say well, that seems not a big deal. But when it's magnified by a couple million people doing it every day, it becomes a big deal. And it kind of works on our psyches and we start to think that way. With cancel culture, I try to think about, are we doing punishment? Are we doing accountability? Are we doing a moment for learning and growth? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? I'm personally not a fan of punishment. I don't think punishment serves anyone very well. I do think accountability is important. And so then asking in any particular situation, what would accountability look like here? And I think that has that element of proportionality that Sarah was talking about. I think it has an element of just basic fairness. I think it has an element of looking at like what opportunities are lost if this person loses a position or loses a platform or whatever it might be. I think redemption has a role to play whenever you're having a conversation about cancel culture. And so it's really situation specific. And I'm trying to have less of a reaction when somebody gets canceled. I'm trying to think less like serves him right or that's terrible and so unfair, and like walk through those questions more. Okay, what's the goal here? And what would accountability look like in this situation? And what is lost because this person has been fired or criticized? I mean, I don't have a lot of patience for the idea that criticism equals cancel culture. I think we really need to like back away from the idea that this is how I've been phrasing it lately. If we're not being affirmed, we're being attacked. I see a bunch of that going on. And so that's where you have to do some personal reflection. Is it just that I wasn't affirmed here? Is that the problem? I wasn't canceled. I just wasn't affirmed. We have to expect that from each other.
Well, in the country of 300 million people, we're all not going to agree on a goal either.
Mm-hmm.
There are some people who the goal inside these conflicts is to exercise some anger, to exercise some trauma. You know, everybody's starting in different places. And for better, for worse, I think sometimes the social media conversation wants everybody to be in the same place. And that's just impossible. It is just impossible. We are not in the same place, nor will we ever be. And I think Brenda's point to sort of the art of disagreement, how young we learn it, gets to the point of like, we're all in different generations and have, dramatically different understandings and experiences with disagreement. I was talking to my grandmother who's 84, and she was like, well, we didn't talk about politics. We didn't fight about politics. And I was like, well, did you argue about anything? And she was like, yeah, denominations. Like that was like the big societal conflict was Baptist versus Presbyterian versus Methodist or whatever the case may be where she was, and I think realizing that when we say, we hear a lot of adult children talking about parents that they have conflicts with and saying like, I thought they taught me to be this way. And it's like, they don't know how to have a conversation where there's disagreement. And I'm like, well, that's because they didn't grow up doing that. I think you see that with conversations about race. When you're from a generation that grew up singing Avenue Q, everybody's a little bit racist. Being called racist feels very different than if you grew up watching protests surrounding the Jim Crow South, where racist meant that you were a KKK burning crosses on somebody's lawn. And so the word even means something, I think, very different across generations. And so you get that reaction, you get that sort of life experience bubbling up to the surface. But, one of my favorite writers, Lindsay Pollock, on sort of cross-generational workplaces says, like, there's nothing fundamentally different about our psychology across generations. It's just about expectations. We just expect different things from disagreement. We expect different things from political conversations. We expect different things from younger generations. If you came from a generation where, respect meant keeping silent and letting old people steer the way, or like if you came from a generation where you feel like the height of individuality and respect is being heard, then yeah, those are going to come into conflict with one another. Not because, the one person's doesn't love the other person or anything like that, but it's just our perspectives and our experiences guide those expectations. And if we're never articulating like what's going on or really trying to examine what's coming to play besides you're the worst and I'm the best, then we're never going to make any progress.
I want to make sure that we don't miss Donna's comment about the big lie and kind of where our democracy is and voter suppression, because I do think this is something worth a lot of time and focus. Something that I am learning is that the big lie is a really difficult term among people who don't follow politics the way that I follow politics. because I think that if you're talking to people who maybe show up just to vote in presidential elections, aren't that engaged, really prefer not to think about this more than every 4 years, they would say on average, I care a lot about election security. I think it's really important for it to be fair. And you see in focus group data that most people believe that some cheating goes on in every election. Now, if you are a political kind of fanatic the way that we are, you can quickly say, it mostly doesn't, it gets caught, it's very hard to pull it off, we know about it when it happens, it's so isolated, it never affects the outcome. But like a conversation among political fanatics doesn't move the ball very far in this country. So I am first trying in conversations about what happened in the last election to remember that, like, I have read the court opinions and the person I'm talking to probably hasn't, and that's okay. And so where can we begin? I like to ask people, like, what concerns do you have coming out of the last election? Did you vote differently in the last election? Did you like that? I happened to love filling in my absentee ballot. I happened to love showing up to vote early. How was that for you? Was it different for you this time? How was that experience? Did you have any concerns at your polling place? Did you see anything that didn't feel right to you? You know, can we just have a really pragmatic conversation first about your personal voting experience? Because most people's passion arises from something personal to them. And if you can show them in a conversation that nothing personal to them is wrong, it might like dial back some of those concerns that are being fed to them from media outlets. And
So
I think go ahead, Sarah.
Go ahead. I was going to clarify with Barbara. I was asking my grandmother about the adults when she was growing up. So this would have been like she's 84. So this would have been like her parents in the 30s and 40s that she was watching have conversations. And again, this is probably cultural too. This is in Kentucky, which brings me to, I wanted to say something about Giselle's point, which I thought was so good about being from Springfield and talking to her liberal friends in California. You know, I just did that New York Times thing where you plug in your address and they tell you if you're in a bubble. And I know this might surprise some people, but actually in Paducah, Kentucky, I'm not in a bubble. It was like 58% Republican and 42% Democratic, which is pretty evenly split. It's a very, it's not perfectly even, but I mean, and it would definitely lean red. We've had Republican representation for a long time, but there is a healthy Democratic voting population in my town, which I'm so thankful for. I've never been more thankful for it during COVID, because I had dear beloved friends who I thought were taking COVID way too seriously, and dear beloved friends who I thought were not taking it seriously enough. And like having that experience of seeing these people and not like putting them into a box and then becoming sort of faceless, like they were real people to me. And honestly, a year out, I can say like the people who were taking it not seriously enough at the time, I think they've been right about some stuff. And the people who were taking it too seriously, I think have been right about some stuff. So I can like see that with these relationships in my town, because there is such a mix, and I'm really close friends with a mix of people. And I think that is such a gift. And I have been in these conversations that Giselle is talking about with my very liberal friends from law school who live in California and New York City, and who are just so dismissive in a way that really does break my heart. Like a way that is they are just responding to every stereotype. They are assuming the absolute worst. And what I think is really, you know, there's a lot at risk sort of on the like spiritual community civic level, but right now when we're talking about vaccines, there's real public health risk, because shame does not motivate people. Scolding does not motivate people. Motivating people through public health to do things like get a vaccine, wear a mask, socially distance is a very delicate psychological process. Now, I think there is a healthy role for social pressure, but social pressure is not shaming. That's very different. And I think listening to people, you have to believe that people have like certain validity to their beliefs. You have to just sort of think they have a right to hold their own opinion. in order to address their hesitancy or answer their questions. Like, if you come from a sense of like sort of looking down on them and thinking they are being ridiculous, they will sense that immediately, and you're not going to get anywhere. And I think like when we're talking about noticing, like actually motivating people to give the vaccine, which is in all of our interest, really like recognizing human dignity and meeting people where they are at, because you cannot control that. You know, like you just can't, all the New York Times pieces or Atlantic charts or data or hospital websites, like it doesn't matter. You have to really meet people on a human level. It's not that they're lacking, like they don't have access to Google and can't drown themselves in information. They need a connection. They need a human connection that they trust to help them walk through this decision making, which is fraught. It is a fraught thing to think about. You know, I was just thinking about the other day, like at the end of the day, vaccines are kind of bananas. You're like, no, listen, I'm just gonna put a little bit of something that can make you really, really, really sick in order to not make you sick. Like it's kind of wacky when you just write it out like that. It's like those TikToks where someone explains a clock and you're like, yeah, the clocks are crazy. How do we come up with this system? Like you just have to give a little grace for like, let people meet people where they're at, because trying to control them through shame or scolding is not going to get anybody anywhere. And I just think that's really, really like has to be a constant reminder.
And I think we just have to remember that people don't make rational decisions. I was watching a news report the other day about a man whose mother was on a ventilator with COVID. He was standing outside the hospital and he had not been vaccinated. And the reporter was like, the reporter kind of did a double take, like, but your mom is in ICU here. It is looking really bad. Like you haven't gotten the vaccine. And the guy said no. And the reporter said, what would it take for you to agree to get the vaccine? And he said, I don't know. And I thought, well, friend, I can't solve that problem for you either. I mean, there's not a persuasive message, I think, to someone who's been touched personally by a crisis and still won't take that step. And sometimes the answer is time. I hear so many people say they just kind of want to wait and see. Like and we know this about like technology and lots of things. There are early adopters. There are people kind of in the middle. There are laggards. And I think part of what I have to remember, and I don't want to, because I do believe we are in a race against some variants here. And I'm not willing to like just sit on my heels and accept more suffering that's needless. But I have to remember that even though I don't want to accept it, that curve of how people take to new things pretty much always holds true. And some people are just going to take their time about this.
Here's my very intellectual response to Jessica's comment. Ding, 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 ding. Like, I think that you are 100% right about that. That is definitely the experience in my own life with my family members who have not gotten college or higher education, and they sense it it comes up all the time. Like there is like such a resentment and the sense of like, well, you think you're better than us. Because I think there's a lot of societal narratives and pressure about higher education. And it just breaks my heart because one, that's not true. I don't think that, but I do think it does change how you think. I mean, one of the biggest pieces of sort of like aha moment I've ever had is reading. Have y'all ever read Kristen Neff's book, Self-Compassion? It is so good. You should definitely read it. And she has this moment where she's talking about the difference between people who realize that they are being acted on by lots of different forces, that we're not just these like islands acting of our own free will and our own self-control, but that there's a lot of like forces playing out in our individual lives, and the people who just fight that tooth and nail, the sense of like, you know, no, take personal responsibility. No, like you are the captain of your own ship and the master of your own destiny. And that's the biggest separation for me between my family members who have had a higher education and those who haven't. There's a sense of like, no, I will not admit that there are things that work on me that I don't have control over. Even though I don't think that's disempowering, I feel like they see that it is. They talk about it in a way that's like they feel like it's very disempowering. But it is hard to get over that hump. If you're a person who thinks about like psychology and how that plays out with us and trauma or economics, or you just name it, right? Any of these things, versus like thinking like it's really just about you and your inner circle and your family, and that's really all that matters as far as how you make decisions. Like it is a difficult hump to get over. I really, really think it is. And I think that's why. But I also think it's in that same sort of way. It's also a real avenue because you as a person with higher education are a part of that inner circle and that family now, right? And so that creates tension, but that also creates opportunity. And I've definitely seen that play out with some of my family members as well, where I, for better, for worse, like my dad is like full MAGA. We have lots of conversations about that constantly. But he has to say, like, in ways he's probably blocked everybody else who even tiptoes towards my political end of the spectrum on Facebook. Like he can't block me. He did try one time and I was like, no, we're not going to do that, friend. But like he has to kind of stay in connection with me and we just keep working on it. And so, I mean, I think it's hard, but it's also an opportunity.
And I think the education piece is a good place for some humility too. When we talked about unionization on the show, we talked about the fight for a union at one of Amazon's plants. Some of the strongest resistance that we got to that conversation came from Amazon workers. And ultimately, the union was defeated. When we talk about the minimum wage, sometimes we hear the most from people who make the lowest wages saying, I'm concerned that if we have this federal increase in the minimum wage, jobs like mine are going to go away, my hours are going to be cut. So I think it's really important, as someone who really values that education, to remember that there are lots of ways to learn. And there are lots of life experiences that give you insight. And I truly believe that if we can look for ways to respect those different experiences and the insight that they provide, we could lower some of the temperature in our political conversations as well. Like I hate the phrase people voting against their own interest. I think when folks say that, especially in kind of news media, I can just feel things shutting down. It just comes across in such a condescending way. So I think we have to look for opportunities to see where education is creating a gap and think through what everyone is bringing to the table around a conversation where that gap is being felt.
I will never forget one time I was having a conversation with my dad. I think it was around the Kavanaugh hearing. And he said, I still have worth. I know I'm just an old white guy, but I still have worth. I'm still worth something. And it broke my heart that he even felt like he had to articulate that the message he'd received was that I'm not worth anything anymore in this society. And I think that's what people hear when we like draw those lines, or we say things like voting against their interest. There's a real paternalizing, and people can smell it from a mile away. There's no hiding it. When people are being talked down to, they sense it immediately. I know I do. I call it mansplaining. I get it a lot. I don't like it, and so I think that we all have that. We've all had that experience and know that feeling. And as much as we can protect it in our conversations and in our relationship, it's a really important thing to do.
I think Angela is so right about vaccines and fear. My father-in-law won't get vaccinated, and my husband, I keep saying to him, but why? Why won't your dad do this? And my husband's just been really clear with me, like he won't say it out loud, but he's just afraid. He's just afraid. And I think Angela's exactly right that it is that you cannot argue someone out of a feeling that they have. And that translates to lots of different political topics as well, right? And if we can learn to see the feeling instead of pretending that we're all very coolly discussing policy, I think that helps us.
What else y'all got? What else you got for us? Oh, you got that. Okay, so somebody asked for the self-compassion. It's really good. And look, you know what? That book, It's relevant because so often what's happening in these conversations is we're just working out our own stuff on each other. And if you don't have any awareness, if you have not worked on like, oh, the self-righteousness is because I feel all this pressure. And so once I recognize the fact that I feel like I have to control everything, and why isn't everybody else doing that too? Then you're walking into a lot of minefields. And I think, that's definitely something I've done in my own life. Like I felt the pressure to be perfect. And I don't know if y'all do that. If y'all know much about the Enneagram, I love it, but I'm an Enneagram 1. And so I feel the pressure to be perfect and better. And I really resent it when everybody else doesn't rise to the challenge. I'm over here trying hard. Y'all can all try harder. I can really get in that space very, very easily. And I think that sort of siren song of self-righteousness, man, like it can really motivate us inside these experiences and these communications and these relationships. And it's just something I have to like really, really have to keep an eye on. As far as like the tips and tools that when we are in hard conversations, I mean, what Beth has taught me that I think is really valuable is annotating the conversation, just like saying, I'm feeling very defensive right now. I need to articulate that. I'm feeling really angry. I don't feel like you're listening to me. I mean, honestly, if you've ever had any sort of marriage counseling, it's so helpful. Like reflective listening. What I'm hearing from you is that you think poor people are lazy. I don't really think that represents your values, but that's what it feels like you're articulating to me. Being able to voice that and reflect it back to people, it slows the conversation down a little bit. It gets people a little bit out of that like volleying back and forth that can just take on a momentum of its own, and remind you that like what we're trying to do here is connect with one another, not formulate some sort of immigration plan. And I think that can be really, really helpful.
I always try to remember that there are two things going on in every interaction. You're talking about whatever you're talking about, but you're also like working on your relationship with another person. And so when you're in a hard discussion and things get really tense, I like to just kind of step out of the thing we're talking about and say, this is feeling really tense right now. I must feel more strongly about this than I realized. This must be more personal to me than I realized. And I probably need to take a second and think about why. Or if you're with a family member, you could say, can we just like time out for a second? How do you think it is that we grew up so similarly and have reached such different conclusions about this? Like what in our life experiences do you think has made us see this so differently? You could definitely do that within your chapters, right? Like here we are, we have so much in common. What do you think it is that makes us view this so differently? I never knew that you felt this way about this. It's really surprising based on what I know about you. Where does this come from? I want to know more. Here's my favorite tip for when you're having a hard conversation with someone who has more power than you. So like if you're in a work situation or maybe with a professor and someone is like coming at you hard about something, I always like to say, do you mind if I take a few notes? And like, I just will either like tap on my computer or write down on some paper in front of me. And I'll just say like, it helps me think through things to take a few notes. What you're saying is important to me. I want to make sure I understand it. And something about knowing that someone's taking notes on what people say, it just brings them down to a more human level. Again, they start to act like a person whose words are worth writing down. So I think that helps. And then I always remember, and I actually learned this from a FIMU national officer when they were doing recruitment training. She said, like, anytime you feel stuck in a hard conversation, you just put the responsibility back on the other person. And she said, like, literally think of like removing the responsibility from your shoulders and putting it on them with a question. And my favorite question is, can you say more about that? If I have no idea what to say next, I will just say, can you say more about that? And let the person keep talking. And often I find that when the other person keeps talking, they kind of get to something I can work with, and that helps. And I think it's really important too, to just know how to be done, to be able to say to someone, thank you for telling me this. I have enjoyed talking to you about it. I realize it doesn't feel like we've reached like a satisfying conclusion, but I need to think about this some more. I'd love to talk with you about it again sometime, but I need some time right now to sort of process what we've discussed. I feel like most people avoid hard conversations because they don't know how to get out of them. And if you can practice the words of wrapping up a conversation, making it real clear that we'll come back and do this later, but we're done for now, it gets much more comfortable to be in them.
Angela asked us, do you think that it is possible for white people to truly relate to the stresses and slights that people of color are experiencing in our society? Should we say anything or just be there for empathy? So I wish I could give you one rule that I think will work all the time, but I cannot do that. I think it very much depends on the level of connection inside the relationship and the environment in which you're having the conversation. I think there is never too much empathy. So I think that always being there and validating and affirming another person's experience is really important. You know, I think that in our society, we do this thing where we think in order to feel the same things, we have to experience the same experiences. And so I would guard against that. I mean, I think in our individual lives, we can all feel heartbreak without having the exact same experience of heartbreak. And we can all feel sadness or disappointment. But I think, you know, the truth is, no, I mean, as a white person, I'm not going to ever experience systemic racism. It's just not, it's not going to happen. Not in our society. That's not the way the power is structured. But I think if, you know, if someone is experiencing a real like disappointment, standing there in empathy with them, or anger or frustration or whatever, is still valuable, even if you have not had that exact same experience. And I think that as white people, we just have to be willing to sort of like mess up a lot more, like to understand that we're going to get it wrong. We're going to say the wrong thing. I try desperately hard not to be somebody's trapdoor. I don't want that. I don't want that for anybody who's trusted me and come into conversation or relationship with me, to have that experience where they feel like they trusted me and I opened up a trapdoor and they fell through it. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to ever, like, I'm always going to say exactly the right thing, or get every single conversation or situation perfect. And if I set that standard for myself, I will never try. And so it's this really delicate balance of, you know, giving grace to myself and the other person, being able to lean into the vulnerability and empathy of understanding that I won't get it all wrong. But that we are both still human beings sharing a human experience and hopefully a human connection, and sort of holding that delicately all at the same time.
One of my favorite poems has this section in it that says, I want you to be with pain, mine or your own, without moving to hide it or fade it or fix it. And I think that that's a really good posture to be in with anyone who's expressing some kind of suffering. And I think it's a good guideline when we think about the racial experiences in our country. I also think a lot about our friend Megan Devine, who has written a book called It's Okay That You're Not Okay on grief. And she's so good at reminding us not to do the grief Olympics, which I think is something that I've seen a lot of white people trying to do in empathizing with racial issues. It's just really not a good idea to do the grief Olympics in any situation, you know, and I don't think we need to like come to those conversations prepared to say, well, here's my equivalent experience of injustice. Like that doesn't solve anything. The other thing I'm learning about equity is that often my desire to hide it, fade it, fix it on an individual level as a white person is the exact wrong impulse. It's sometimes more helpful for me to not do. So sometimes it's important, I think, in my journey to try to support greater racial equity in our country, to say, like, is there a person of color who could take this board seat instead of me? Or I have an opinion on something happening at my children's school, and I think about the Nice White Parents podcast, and I've just kind of developed Nice White Parent as like a shortcut for myself to say, like, perhaps you don't see the full picture and maybe your voice is not needed on this topic, right? Because this doesn't really affect your kids as much as it affects other kids, or whatever it is. So I'm trying to more like see some of my contributions in this space as just pausing and stepping back instead of leaning forward and trying to have an answer for everything.
So I want to talk about Judy's question. What about pro-life people who support gun rights and don't care about people dying in school shootings or people dying of COVID because they won't wear a mask? So let me tell you a very personal story. So I was a victim of a school shooting on December 1st, 1997 in my hometown of Paducah, Kentucky. One of my classmates walked into a prayer circle, opened fire, and killed 3 of my classmates. I have a friend of mine in the same grade as me. Her name is Jana. Her friend, best friend, Casey, was shot and killed in front of her that day. Her daughter, 20-something years later, was an attendance at a school nearby in Marshall County, Kentucky, and was also a victim of a school shooting. She was in a school. We had another school shooting about 20 miles away from my high school. So she's a multi-generation family with with her and her daughter who experienced school shootings. Hers in particular was very traumatic. Jana is as pro-life as they come, and she is passionately pro-gun. If I put up a selection of her Facebook posts right now, you would be appalled. Now, what part of those experiences should I invalidate? They are both part of her. She is complex. I'm not inside her head, but I cannot look at her and say, you don't care about school shootings, because she has experienced it both as a student and as a mother, and she watched her best friend get killed. Now, she has taken that experience in a very different direction in her life than I have. But it doesn't mean the experience didn't happen. And I think with issues of life and death, be it abortion or gun rights or COVID, the most fundamental thing that I think is true of all humans is we do have a will to survive. We do want to live. And most of us, except for this very small part of the population for which this is true, who are true identifiable and diagnosable sociopaths, don't wish death and destruction on our fellow citizens. We mostly want to survive, and we mostly wish the same for other people. And we just express that differently. That is very, very hard to hear. It is as a victim of school shooting, as a former employee of Planned Parenthood, I have, truly fought this reality. And there are lots of things and fundamental values that I really disagree with, that I think are really different, even between me and Jana. But the idea that she wants people to die and I don't is just not one of them. That's just not what separates us. There are things that separate us, even though we share this very traumatic experience from our youth. But that is not one of them. That's not one of them. And I think that's just really, really hard. But I think we could get so much further if we didn't start from this very you want people to die and I don't. Because it's just more complicated than that. I think are you raising your hand? Judy, yes, Judy is raising her hand. I don't know how to unmute Judy.
I guess the conversation would be when people are acting very self-righteous about it.
Yeah.
I know they're entitled to their opinion, but to me, of course, it doesn't really make sense to me, but it's just the self-righteousness about how, you're a baby killer. When they say that to somebody who is opposed or who is pro-choice, they call them a baby killer. So it doesn't
I always have to remind, this is true for me, and I think this is true generally. The stronger the self-righteousness, usually the stronger the foundation of fear on which that self-righteousness is resting, right? It's it's like how, children behave. The more stubborn they are, the more scared they are. You know what I mean? It's there's usually something fueling that. Really strong, harsh, arguably cruel reaction. And it's usually not one thing either. Right now, I'm so worn out with the conversation around unemployment benefits, as if someone's decision to take a job or not to take a job, to stay home, to use a government check or to not, is motivated by one thing. I can't think of a single thing I do in my life, from what I wear to if I exercise, what I eat, that is motivated by a single thing. It's always very complex. There's always lots of things acting on me. Everything from advertising to societal culture to history to my family to genetic. I mean, you name it. Like I could go on for 15 minutes about all the things that act on us and push on us. And so I just, when it, listen, it's amazing that we've made it this far without me mentioning Oprah. She's like my mother. I watched her every day of my life for 20 years. I don't remember the first episode I watched because I always watched it. And I will never forget, as long as I live, there was a moment where she was interviewing women in prison who had killed their children. Really the most heinous of crimes that you could possibly imagine. But she's talked to them and she listened to them. And at the end, one of the women said, I thought you were just coming here to sort of like exploit us and film us and use us for your show. I didn't really think you were interested in what we said. And Oprah said, you dealt with your pain your way, and I deal with my pain my way. And I think that's just, some people deal with their pain by being really, really nasty. Just cruel and mean and nasty. And so I just have to really remind myself of that's where that's coming from, And it's really hard. I mean, we had some really, really mean, nasty protesters when I worked at Planned Parenthood. And I've had people say really nasty, mean things to me about gun violence. And I just have to remember, like, they deal with their pain their way, and I deal with my pain my way. Because Oprah told me that's how I'm supposed to think about it. And I do whatever Oprah tells me to.
I am concerned that this country is going to tear itself apart over abortion. I really am. And so when that conversation shows up in my life, I try not to bring it up. But when it shows up in my life, my objective in a conversation like that is to have everyone sit with the fact that abortion is hard. I think abortion is hard, and I think it should be hard. I think matters of life and death and any ways that humans can interfere with what would otherwise happen naturally, and I define that real broadly. I think a lot about artificial intelligence and assisted suicide and all that stuff is hard, and it should be hard. And if we can come to that in a discussion, I feel like it's a win, I especially feel that way in conversation with my most pro-gun friend. Because getting back to what Sarah said earlier about the belief that lots of factors are working on a person versus the belief that they are in total control of their own destiny, I see that so much talking about the Second Amendment. The person in my life who I respect, who is smart and thoughtful and caring, who is the most extreme about gun rights. And he's extreme. His views are extreme about it. I said to him the other day, I feel like you and Clarence Thomas would say if somebody wants to saw off their arm and replace it with an AK-47, that'd be just fine. And he was like, well, who would tell it, my body, my choice. Like, that's literally what he said to me. Okay. So he's extreme about this. But what we always come to when we peel back the layers of things is that he believes there are good people who should be able to protect themselves, and there are bad people who will evade any law in order to do bad things. And that's his view of the world. And I always say back to him, I just don't see that line clearly, because I think we're all just people who have moments when we are capable of really extraordinarily terrible things, who are capable of really extraordinarily desperate acts. And so I'm concerned about providing us these destructive tools for those moments when we could cross that line. And that's a really different view of human nature that we're arguing about. I think we're often arguing about really different views of human nature, though, instead of policies. And it helps me to, we're probably never going to work that out, my friend Eric and I. But it is, I think, a good and worthy exercise to talk about it at that level instead of to stay in the slogans.
Yeah, I think that is a really good encapsulation. I think, some people there are good people and there are bad people, and some people are like full Oprah. And listen, I would tell that anecdote to people, some people in my own family, and they would roll their eyes so hard they'd get stuck. If I said, I'm being led by Oprah telling me something, you deal with your pain your way and I deal with my pain my way, they would literally roll their eyes so hard they would get stuck. That's okay. There's room for all of us at the table. And we need, like, I mean, there is a part of me that thinks in a multicultural democracy, if we're going to keep up this nation state thing, which we've seemed really committed to, we do need people who are like, oh no, we need boundaries, we need lines, there are bad people out there and good people. Like, there is a little bit of that has to sort of be present. Like, we do need people who see the world very differently in order to make the best decisions and the best policies. As much as I'd like to, like, be in charge of the world and wave magic wands, it probably, like, would not end up as well as I think it would. I think that's the premise of the last Wonder Woman movie, if I remember correctly. And that's just something, like, we all have to keep in mind. Like, we don't all have a monopoly on what is right and what is wrong and which policy works and which policy doesn't. And it's often more complicated because we are blinded by our own experiences and our own limitations. Don said you didn't even like that movie. I didn't. That's true. I did not like the last Wonder Woman movie. I like Gal Gadot. I thought the movie had some problems. Like the fact that somebody could have just said, I wish this was over, but it's fine. Whatever.
I will tell you that when we are out traveling, which has been a while, maybe it's changed, but pre-pandemic, when we were on the road a lot, the number one thing people talk to us about is in terms of dividing their families, dividing their communities, dividing their organizations, was abortion. And I am here for a soul-searching conversation about why that is. And a conversation not just about the tactics of particular groups that found that to be a wedge issue to help them advance campaigns and amass donors and power, but also about why that worked. You know, I think it's really important to examine, like, what is the canvas that we've been writing our political history on that has made this so effective and so divisive, and a place where we really do lose our capacity for nuance and gray areas and really difficult decisions and the ability to give each other the benefit of the doubt in our decision making. I mean, I think we need some serious exploration of that issue by people who have lots of different perspectives on it. But a genuine, curious, searching inquiry into how we got here, I think, is really important. How else can we be helpful and supportive to you all while we have time together? Trying to see if we've missed anything. Oh, thanks, Karen. I noticed a couple more comments about elections. So maybe we could go back to that for just a second. So if you go back to that premise that, like, average voter wants to have elections be secure, and I saw comments about there are always things to question and the questions are increasing. Like, I think that's an important conversation. We've heard from so many people who don't understand why voter ID requirements are labeled as voter suppression efforts. You know, so if this is an issue that you're passionate about, spending some time with some examples ready to talk with people about that, I find that people's minds open pretty quickly when you start to have that discussion. Hey, what about folks who don't have permanent addresses? Hey, what about issues of transportation and, you know, the process of getting an ID? You know, a lot of people will still come around to, like, getting an ID doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me, but that's fine. Then you kind of got some layers and some depth to the discussion. And I just try to keep pulling back in these conversations to, do you want it to be easy to vote in America or not? And it is interesting how many people will say no. Like, there are lots and lots of people who truly think it should not be easy to vote in America. And getting behind that is quite an exercise as well.
I think that's a good example, though. I think that there's a lot of times where when we lean into these conversations and we're curious, we find there are surprising opinions and there are surprising like values and ideas that we're like, oh, huh, okay, now I know what I'm dealing with. Now I know what I'm dealing with. And I think that's really important. And you know, what we want to leave you guys with is that curiosity, the leaning into the discomfort with the faith that there will be a deeper connection afterwards. Like you will understand yourself better, you will understand the other person better, you will hopefully understand your community better. Maybe not the first time, maybe not the second time, maybe just on average over the next 10 times, but it is there, that sense of like the strengthening of connection and the muscle you build where you can sort of navigate these conversations and you can see threads coming up over and over again. It really is. It is the most rewarding experience to connect with people like this, and just like we have here tonight. So thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you for your great questions and for the discussion. It's just such a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, we want to thank you all for joining us and for being our fearless leaders for this past hour. I think it was fantastic. I do need to make a plug. So if you all would, we dropped a link to the assessment. It is quick, it is painless, but it will help us so much as we continue to plan programming in the future. So if you could take just a couple minutes to fill that out, and Annie will drop it again so it's fresh in the chat for us. And again, want to echo just a huge, huge, huge thank you to our partners at the DT Foundation, specifically the Empower Circle for this one. We cannot do these programs without them. So want to say thank you so much. And if you want to learn more about, even if you're like, I don't even know what this Empower Circle is, would love for you to hop on over to the website and take a look because it's pretty cool. Thank you. We will be in touch with additional programming opportunities throughout the summer and next year as well. And again, Sarah, Beth, thank you, thank you, thank you. A million thank yous for spending tonight with us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was really great.
Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.